Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Music Production Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Funk. I make music as Afro DJ Mac. And today I am sitting with Marie Lim. Hi, Claire.
Hi, hello.
Hi, good to talk to you. Claire is an electronic digital instrumentalist. We should use the proper title. And doing some really cool work in the world of where electronic musical instruments are getting kind of the credit they deserve, but also your own music and lots of really interesting stuff. So I'm happy to get a chance to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome to the show.
Hey.
Yeah, so we're both Berklee online people, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, definitely.
And you've been really involved in that new program, the Electronic Digital Instrument Program.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually just graduated from Berklee, but prior to officially graduating earlier this year, I was one of the students who was more involved in the launch of it. And it was really a huge privilege, and I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to contribute in that sense. Because in the way we're kind of really setting the path for the rest of the electronic digital instrument students who will officially be starting in fall of 2019. So that's the first batch of hopefully about 20 people who will be incoming undergraduate students at Berklee on these electronic digital instrument systems.
Right, so that's the actual name of the major, right? Electronic Digital Instrument?
Yeah, so it's the name of the program. So it's not actually a major at Berklee, but for now they're making it stick to the idea of a program. So you would be able to take what they call private instruction or private lessons from a teacher that will help you develop your EDI or electronic digital instrument system over the course of 4 semesters. But that said, you could enter with that as your instrument, but major in something else. Like you don't have to major in electronic production and design, which is the major that most of us currently come from. But you could major in something else like performance on the instrument eventually, or you could even do something like writing or engineering. So it's like a setting point from where you can start off using that as your main instrument in some way, but you don't necessarily have to do a major that's related to electronic music.
So what kind of instruments would be considered as something that would fall under that umbrella?
That's actually a really good question that was, really one of the focuses of developing the curriculum and the process of accepting people and auditioning people. So what the Electronic Production and Design Department at Berklee came up with, and EPD for short, that's the department that's mainly been in charge with spearheading this whole EDI launch. And it was one of my majors when I was at college. So the EPD department set aside kind of 3 main criteria that would kind of comprise, or 3 parts rather, that would comprise an EDI system. So the first would be user-configured software. So that would be, for example, Live or Max or maybe some other kind of software that an instrumentalist has designed that they perform with. Then it would be a computer running that software. So it could be, say, a Mac or maybe nowadays even an iPad or an iPhone, just like running that software that you've developed. So that's the second one. And the third would be some kind of hardware controller. And oftentimes it's more than one controller. So for example, someone could use a push, but then also have an additional MIDI keyboard, and that could be their controllers. And so these 3 parts would make up the entire electronic digital instrument system.
Okay, so and part of the reason I ask that, because when you think of like a MIDI keyboard, it's piano keys.
Right, absolutely.
But what we have that's making this different is the software that's set up by the user.
Right, and that was actually one of the concerns that when it came to really launching the program, the department was really keen on highlighting the idea that it doesn't have to be, a controller that a lot of people use to do like standard music production. It doesn't have to be like an MPK Mini, which has, keys and also pads. It could be something else that's really different. And that's why and you've seen some of the footage that has been used in a lot of the EDI promotional videos and material. Very often they try to not just have a MIDI keyboard there. So even in some of the photos that I was a part of, they specifically requested for me to not bring any of my keyboard controllers into photo shoots or video shoots, just so that they could really, show that you don't have to be a keyboard player in order to participate in being an EDI instrumentalist.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's smart. because it could easily confuse others.
Yeah, and I think it gets even more confusing because, like, with the whole idea of synths and stuff like that, more often than not, you find that synth players are able to play the keyboard just because that's the given interface, like on a Moog or any kind of, like, Dave Smith Prophet, for example. It's all a lot of keyboards, so you don't really get a typical non-keyboard interface for a user to use.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's nice. It probably, like, keeps people feeling like they can be a part of it without that actual, like, traditional instrument, the piano, say. And I see that, like, a lot of times in students where they might say, I don't play an instrument, but then you watch them on, like, the launch pad and you're like, I don't know.
Absolutely.
Kind of looks like you're jamming out on that thing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that you mentioned the launch pad, because one thing that was really crucial in terms of, like, giving examples of controllers was thinking of different layouts of things, and grid controllers were a huge part of that list. So things like the launch pad or the push, even the monem grid as well, and the MIDI fighter, I think is one that's also extremely popular, and that's one of the examples that the faculty members have even used on several occasions to demonstrate the idea of playing very creatively, because it's not even like a typical squishy button, if you know what I mean, on the MIDI fighter. It's like an arcade button. But there are still some artists out there, like Sean Wasabi, for example, who play it beautifully, and they really find a way to be expressive with that. So that was one of, there was a clip of Sean Wasabi that was being used in several meetings to actually demonstrate that, you can definitely use just like a thing with buttons, and that could be your controller as long as you are very expressive of it and you're using it with, like, a software and your computer. So.
Right. And he plays the 64 button MIDI fighter, right? The white one.
Like,
yeah,
it's the big boy.
Colorful. Yeah, I thought that was really cool. The first time I saw that. And I think they sell those now at DJ Tech Tools, if I'm not mistaken. I think you can actually get, because I know that was custom at first, but I think you can actually purchase the 64 button MIDI fighter.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Now that you mention it, I think that the 64 is probably becoming more popular as a result because of, like, Sean Wasabi using it. But I've seen a lot of people use the 16 as well. So, yeah.
And I'm really happy, like, that this whole idea of the, like, customization, the user configured instrument, because that to me is like an art in itself, where we've got these, like, MIDI instruments, our launch pads, our pushes, or whatever, pads, faders, knobs, but they don't do anything until you teach it to do something. Right.
Yeah. I think, like, that's a lot of the idea of the EDI program being a very unique program as well, because if in some sense, nobody's EDI is the same as the next person's. Like, you could be using the same controller, you could both be using Live, or you could both be using Max or whatever software. And at the same time, because of, like, the nature of a lot of live electronic performance, that EDI system that is yours will only be yours. So that's a cool thing too.
It's the thing that really kind of pulled me into Ableton Live, was that I started to feel like the studio was an instrument now. And the software was an instrument that I could kind of work into my own way of doing music. Whereas I was using Pro Tools and Logic and even Digital Performer. And while I had great fun with them, I always felt like I was making music in spite of the software. Like, I was fighting against it, and there was so much learning, figuring out, and trying to make that fit into what I'm doing. Whereas now with Live, it's very customizable, and all those controls allow me to figure out new ways of performing, and that really changes the way I make music too, depending on how I've set it up. Even if it's the actual hardware is the same thing, a different session might be totally new instrument.
Right, absolutely. And I think that's one part of the curriculum that up until now has been, something that a lot of people have focused on, the idea that using Live in a performance setting can be extremely flexible. So that's why I personally find it so exciting that it's, like, kind of officially being institutionalized, if you will, just because it's really, setting in stone that these are the possibilities now that you know about them and you have faculty members and visiting artists who can inform you more about them, that just like takes everything to a different level.
Yeah, I'm kind of optimistic that we'll see some advancements in the application of this stuff too, because really people are figuring it out on their own or through tutorials or, stuff online, but to have like a nice formally recognized, but formally like planned out and like a program to explore this is pretty cool. I think in the courses I teach at Berklee, which I was teaching the advanced music production with Ableton Live, and then now I'm doing the sampling with Ableton Live course. A lot of like the way people are using their MIDI controllers and their digital instruments is not really the point of the course. It's something they're doing in order to do their assignments.
Right.
But this idea that like the program is to help create your instruments and learn how to perform with them is going to make things interesting, just that people are going to be asked to focus on that creation process.
Definitely. And one other thing that came out, which was a little bit more challenging in relation to the idea of like creating a custom system, was the idea of conducting proficiencies. Because the way Berklee works is that in your first 4 semesters on your principal instrument, you will have to take what they call proficiency. So it's almost a little bit like a jury, but every semester for your first 4 semesters, you'll have to have an exam of sorts that basically tests what you've learned for that semester and reflects, the repertoire on your instrument. So for me, that was piano. But and it's a little bit easier for piano just because they've been teaching it for so long. It's been a long part of Berklee's history. But when you think about EDI, it's like, how do we actually test how proficient you are on your EDI that is custom to you? Like, how do you even do that? So that's one thing that I'm actually curious about myself, and I can't wait to see what actually happens from that.
Yeah, so like how well you know your instrument.
Right.
And you may very well have people showing up to demonstrate how well they know their instrument, but no one knows how this instrument really works.
Exactly. And it's funny because when we were doing some of the videos, and there's a Berklee promotional video that's about how to audition on your EDI. And it was funny because we were demonstrating some of the more traditional ways of that you might be tested. So for example, repeating rhythms that are like played to you by your auditioner, or sight reading, and we were half joking about it, but I had to basically sight read on the push for for one part of the video, and I think they were just lucky that they happened to find someone who could sight read on the push. But yeah, I was playing like melodies and stuff just from reading actual classical notation, and for me that was a part of my system, so it ended up working out. But just, that really put an interesting question and thought to a lot of the people involved in that shoot. It's like, how do we actually do this?
I don't read music myself, but I've done a lot of, I can figure it out, but
Right.
Every good boy does fine, but
yeah, definitely.
but like guitar tablature was like what I really learned a lot of stuff on.
Right.
And I could see that working with the push, especially because it's very similar to guitar. A lot of the shapes and intervals are the same, but I've never seen anyone have sheet music and, performing on a push like that. That's pretty interesting.
Right.
That's something I've never really thought of, honestly.
Yeah, and it's I think a lot of people didn't really think about it either until one part of the EDI being a program was really looked into, and that's that every person who plays on an instrument is often involved in an ensemble at Berklee. So that's like a specific class where you're put into basically a group with other musicians who usually have a different instrument from you. So almost like a band, but you're specifically performing one kind of genre as that band. So you could, for example, be the funk and R&B ensemble, or the techno rave ensemble, which I was a part of for some time with Loudon Stearns, actually.
Cool.
Who we know. Yeah, Loudon's amazing. But so yeah, you're put into an ensemble, and up in this coming December, so actually next week, there's going to be a singers showcase at Berklee, which is a semesterly event. But this is the first time that showcase was actually incorporating EDI elements into that. So I was talking to one of the professors involved in that, who was a professor of mine previously, Lee Abe, and he's more of like an arranging and writing teacher, but he was asking me like, since I was one of his students and I read traditional notation but I also play EDI, so he was like, how would you notate this for somebody in an ensemble setting to play? And it was so mind-boggling because I had no idea. And I was thinking, in this case, would I kind of take on the pseudo, classical type of approach where I ask for sheet music and I read it? Or is it better to have chord changes? Or is it better to have just an outline of, in this bar at this moment, play the riser or something like that? So yeah, it's a challenge. And I think we're all still figuring it out, which is the beauty of it in a way. So.
Right. Like things like the white noise swoosh or something like that doesn't translate too well to musical notation.
Yeah. So we were even thinking of like drawing it out or like putting in a picture or maybe just stating it in words.
Right.
But yeah, there are so many ways to go about thinking of how to approach that when you're trying to bring this into a more, jazz-like or traditional institution, if you will. So that's interesting, yeah.
And I wonder how you would deal with things like just the timbre of sounds or certain effects that you put on, like
right.
Say it's like some sort of like gated sound that's kind of like playing a rhythmic thing, or like a something that pans from side to side. How do you express that? Is it sheet music? Is it like piano MIDI notes on a piano? I think that's exciting because it's going to really pose some new ways of thinking about these instruments in order to get to these desired results.
Yeah, and in our exploration of that, we ended up looking at a lot of previous forms of notation, not so much from the pop electronic side of things or the more recent electronic things, but we were thinking even back to like older electroacoustic music in the more classical or academic sense. And we were trying to look for examples of like notation that was drawn out, like Xenakis and Barrio and stuff like that. And those are like classic composers in the more classical vein. But we were even looking to those as examples of, okay, what would make sense for an electronic digital instrument performer to see and then be able to interpret, even if it wasn't like an exact, note by MIDI notation of something out. Yeah.
Yeah, and so many of the sounds in my music, I wouldn't know what to call them or how to write them out.
It's like
that, like that noise, like
it's like insert bloop at bar 28 or something. So
yeah. You got me thinking a little bit about electric guitar. Is that an instrument people can use in Berklee?
Yes. So under Berklee's principal instruments, it would be under guitar, but it's then your choice to say if you want to mainly play an electric or an acoustic, and even then you can choose who you study with as a teacher. So there are kind of flexible options with that. But yeah, electric guitar is definitely currently accepted as a Berklee instrument.
Because when we're talking about proficiency, I can see obviously playing fast or knowing like various chords and theory and things along those lines. But a lot of electric guitar is the tone and how you're interacting with your amplifier. And if you have pedals and effects and all of these, are those factors that are included, or is it a little more the technical playing?
Absolutely. I think from what I understand, because I'm not a guitar principal, so I wasn't, even though I do play a little bit. But from my understanding, I think it really depends on a case-by-case basis. Like I do know a lot of my friends who play a mix of, different kinds of guitars, and some of them use heavy amounts of effects. But I think it also depends on, and this is where it's at, I think it also depends on the rules that are defined, or the guidelines that are defined by that specific department. So for example, when I was, a piano principal at Berklee, there were definitely some set guidelines on what a proficiency would look like. So you would play like a prepared piece from the standard jazz repertoire, or you would play something from the classical repertoire, and then you would be asked to improvise, or you would be asked to play a certain set of scales. I imagine that the guitar proficiency would be somewhat similar, but there are definitely more options than just playing on, a grand piano. That's an interesting thought.
As a guitar player myself, I've always kind of felt like I was maybe if I wasn't like the technically best player, you know, like with speed and things like that, I felt like I had a strength in like tone and
Right,
knowing
yeah.
like how to use that and how to use guitar feedback and lots of little things like that. So as I think about what an electronic digital instrument is like, and so much of that is really taking some of those ideas to even further degrees. So I could almost see where guitar would be an instrument that sort of straddles the two worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's so interesting that you mentioned that because a lot of my friends who are like some of like fantastic EDI players are actually guitarists, and the way that they kind of fuse or bring in their guitar influences into their electronic music is really beautiful. Like one of my friends, he goes by the artist name Eventuate, but he's also a Berklee alum and he's currently in Santa Cruz. He does guitar stuff that's kind of fused with his modular work. He's a huge modular synthesis guy, and the way that he, you know, composes and performs live as well is amazing to watch. And he's actually one of the other students who's in the Berklee electronic digital instrument promotional videos. His name's Jacob Johnson, but he plays on the Monum as well, so he's great with all of that. And just the way that he thinks about a lot of his ideas compositionally and then implements them into his music. I think a lot of it does come from his background in guitar, and he used to be like a really like he used to have like super long hair when he was in high school. He used to like fling it back and forth.
Yeah.
And he rocked out on his guitar, and he wanted to be like a guitarist up until he got to Berklee. I think that was when things started to change, and for a lot of us in our department, actually, like before I came to Berklee, I knew I wanted to be there, but I thought I was just going to be like a writer or an arranger, and I only got into production like after I came to Berklee and I had declared another major. So I had to like do some dropping and switching around, but it ended up working out great. So
Well, that's really nice to hear, because I think that's a good part of like going to a school is not just studying what you want to study, but also like learning new possibilities and new options.
definitely.
And yeah, that seems like a great way to really expose students to that quite a bit. So your work now, I'd like to talk about that too. And yeah, I'm so excited about the Berklee thing. I think this is just a great way to like bring electronic music into acceptance. But you do a lot of cool work on your own outside. And,
Thank you.
And I guess that's
Thank you.
why you have been selected as like this kind of representative of where the school's trying to go in terms of like direction with digital instruments. Can you tell us a little bit about your music? So you come from, is it a classically like trained piano?
Yeah, that's right.
then-
So I started playing classical music at a pretty young age. I think I must have been about 6, and my parents wanted me to start learning piano, as every Asian family wants their kid to. So I started piano when I was 6 years old, and I'm originally from Singapore, so I started it back there where it's very common for young children to, you know, be trained in a classical instrument. I would say it's almost like a rite of passage in some sense.
Nice.
Yeah, in the country, a lot of people play classical music when they're younger, or they take some kind of formal lessons. So I started classical piano when I was 6. When I was 11 or 12, I began flute. So I'm trained in both of those, and I eventually worked my way up to get diplomas in those. So it's like, yay, it's great. And I love still playing classical music. But that was my background essentially, and it was through that classical music vein that I actually first got introduced to electronic music, and it ended up being more in the classical vein, if you will. So like electroacoustic stuff, sound art, music concrete, those kinds of things. And I only really got into the more contemporary sorts of electronic music after I came to Berklee. And it was like in my 2nd or 3rd semester that I got really into it, just because of the people I was being surrounded by. A lot of my close friends we ended up all being in the same major, and we ended up all having, you know, the same interests in some sense in electronic music. So I was really fortunate to be in that environment. And I think I was just fortunate enough to meet some really good people, because if I hadn't met the specific people that I did meet, I probably wouldn't be here right now. So definitely important.
And the music you're doing is under the name DollTr?
Yeah, that's right. So I
Yeah.
go by the name DollTr for my electronic music. It's my main artist project. I do have a separate project that does more experimental and even more classical academic things, if you will. It's called Cable Wrapper. it's
Cable Wrapper,
it's-
okay.
Yeah, but it's a little bit of a smaller side project. So that's actually the place where that's the name that I use when I do like a lot of modular performance. It's a little bit more experimental. But my main project is DollTr, and through that I do a lot of I try to do a lot of live electronic music, but I also do workshops for live electronic music. And that's something that I'm really getting into more now that I've graduated and I have more time that I can offer to that. So, yeah.
So you're getting more into like the educational side of stuff.
Yeah,
too.
and it's been really great. I think and this is actually news that I just got like yesterday night, but I applied for a grant in Queens, which is where I'm currently based, and it was an artist grant to create work for the borough, and I got the grant.
Wow, congratulations.
So it was, I think they said it was 4 out of 83 people who got the grant.
Really?
So in 2019, I'll be creating like a work for the borough, and something that I wanted to really focus on was having the opportunity to lift up other young women of Asian descent in the area in music technology. So my intention is to go around to different schools, conduct these workshops that I've done for some time, but this time reach out specifically to young women who might be interested in collaborating with me, and hopefully the entire process through around summer of 2019 will be to create an album and then have like a live premiere of the music from that album, which was made by these young women of Asian descent in New York. So
Nice.
that'll be fun. Yay!
Yeah, that is super cool.
Thank you.
I'm happy to see a lot of efforts by women artists to promote the work of women, and I think I'm starting to see like a little like trickle down thing happening. Like as I teach in the high school, I'm finding more and more of the female students are, for one, I've started this music production club where we learn Ableton and Push, and it's about half and half, 50-50 really.
That's awesome. That's so great.
It is, because I was doing it a couple years ago and it was just all boys. You know, that was it. And then like little by little, and also like a lot of the girls are playing ukulele, and that's taking them into guitar. And I'm just noticing over like the years that I've been teaching, it seems like there's this more like empowerment thing going on where places you just didn't see the girl students, the female students, they're now starting to occupy. They've got rock bands, they're into electronic music, and it's just nice because a lot of my students are very like steeped into like the traditional band thing, and like really finding themselves as they start branching out.
That's awesome to hear. That's so cool.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm happy to hear you're doing that, and that's fun to see.
Thank you.
I'm excited to see where you take it because you have so much passion for it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Nice. So there's a really cool video that I got to direct people to of you. Own Devices, it's called.
Yeah. So Own Devices is actually, I would consider it less of a DollTr thing and more of just a Claire Marie Lim kind of
This
thing.
is like a pretty big experiment, right?
Yeah, experiment is completely the right word. It was actually an experiment that started while I was at Berklee, but the idea of it came long before. It probably came when I was, a teenager, or maybe even before that. Because growing up, I did the classical music thing as we talked about, but before that, when I was 3, my mom started me in dance classes, and dance has been like a huge passion of mine as well. I mean, ultimately, I didn't really pursue it as my main at the moment, but I love doing it, and I love exploring the idea of movement and music having a relationship, because they do. It's crazy. I mean, even as a performer and as a musician, when we are live and we're performing, we're interacting with the audience, we're moving, we're locking eyes with people, we're, listening to their feedback, feeling them physically with their energy. So Own Devices was the first time that I really got to bring 2 of my passions together in an academic setting and in an environment where I could really have the chance to explore this connection with music technology, which at the time was my major. So I think I was in a really good place to do that. And Own Devices ended up being my final thesis project for my major at school in the electronic production and design department.
Nice. And you're incorporating quite a lot of these gestural devices. I think you use the what is it called? The Microsoft I can't think of the name. It tracks your movements. I think,
are you talking about the Kinect?
Yes, the Kinect. Yeah, is that what you're using?
So the Kinect it's funny you mentioned that. The Kinect was actually used in one of the earlier prototypes, but I didn't manage to fully exploit it, also partially because the Kinect is more or less optimized to work on Windows computers. And I could ultimately, try to do that on my Mac, but Mac is my main platform. And for the other parts of Own Devices, a lot of it was being run on, some parts are being run in like Logic and Live, and it was just coming across in like so many different platforms that were mostly optimized for Mac. So it made more sense for me to try and stick with that. But the Kinect was one of the first things that I explored because it does some really nice motion tracking of its camera. But in the end, for motion tracking, I ended up using a bunch of different controllers, as well as cameras. So computer vision, and physically seeing the camera tracking for motion.
Right. And for people that have yet to see the video, the music and the dance are tied together. So as you're moving, the music is changing and evolving.
Right, absolutely. So basically Own Devices is a suite of pieces for motion and electronics, I called it. So the idea is that the motion part, or the dancer, is becoming a controller in a sense, because she is controlling the music either by creating sounds, so actual synthesis, or triggering samples, or transforming the sounds in certain ways, so like applying audio effects like delays or filters based on her movement. So because of that, I ended up using a lot of different technologies for the different things that I wanted to create. And a lot of it sometimes would be a backwards process. So I would think of the choreography and what I would want to have my body do, and think about how can we make this specific type of movement or this trajectory of, say, my arm or my leg turn into something that would be very beautiful in a more auditory sense. And then sometimes I would work the other way. So I think of, this is a really nice thing to have as a gestural, control. So how do we make that work? And I think I had the benefit of being trained in both music and in dance. So that ended up working out pretty well for me. And in the end, I was also the performer. So it was kind of like a one-woman sort of thing. Right. But it was a really good experiment to be able to think about, should I use the camera to do this? Or should I use, say, a leap motion controller, which is what I use for one of the movements? Or should I use the hot hands, which is another controller that tracks position to do a certain thing musically?
Oh, that's pretty interesting. So you're letting the dance inform the music. Whereas I think most of the time we think of like dance as almost the reaction to the music.
Right. And that was actually one of the seeds, if you will, of what got me started in the first place, because I almost remember the exact performance or series of performances that made me start thinking about this. And it was back in Singapore, but I was watching a performance of a piece by Yuri Kilian. He's a choreographer that does a lot of work with the Netherlands Dance Theater, which is a contemporary dance company. And there was a particular piece called Toss of a Dice that had a really, really beautiful interaction between the dancers, the music, and also a live sculpture that was moving. It was created by like a Japanese sculptor who was basically getting the sculpture to move in time and respond to the dancer's movements. So as the dancer would approach the sculpture would like change its shape. It's really hard to explain, and it sounds completely like delirious, but if you can go and check a clip, or if you ever manage to watch it, you'll see that it's really beautiful. It's called Toss of a Dice. And the way that the music and the dance interacted was also amazing. And in this case, I believe the music was specifically composed for the choreography, and that's why it interlocked so well. But I was thinking, hey, what if the dancers were actually, because some of the movements were so synced up. So I was like, hey, what if the dancers were actually making that happen with themselves? And that wasn't the case, but I was just like, what if,
Yeah.
So.
That's cool. I have to say, like, for quite a while anyway, I've sort of seen like the whole gestural interaction with the music where I'm going to like, you know, I haven't seen a lot of purpose to it, practical purpose. It's very cool that you can do that. I can wave my hand and like the filter opens. I picture myself doing a live performance and, you know, I can almost have to laugh at myself, like how ridiculous I imagine I'd probably look doing that. But it wasn't until I spoke with Jesper Nordin, who created Gestrament.
Yes.
Have you seen this? It's the iPad app that what I like about it is, you know, so many apps are, as much as like you touch it, it's kind of like weird to touch a piano key on the screen. You don't really feel it. You don't feel the knob turn, but his app is more like kind of sweeping around, and it's very interesting how he does it. And he has it connected to the Microsoft Kinect. And there's a great video of him moving his hands. And now seeing that, it's like, okay, now this is starting to make a little more sense to me, where you could actually use this. And what you've done too is very interesting in that, again, like the movements now are the first thought, and then the music follows.
Right, yeah, and I think I saw that video as well, so I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And I think like technology in that vein is really what my concern with own devices is more related to. Just the idea of being able to take a step beyond, okay, I'm doing this gesture just because it looks cool and people can see it.
Yeah.
And it makes like a sound that they can hear and like a change that is audible, you know.
It felt
And
like a
I
gimmick
think-
to me. You know,
Yeah,
like
no,
in the
exactly.
beginning, like,
And especially for a lot of, you know, certain demos where of various controllers or various gesture recognition devices that have like a bunch of people super happy and like jamming out and, you know, in the woods or something. I felt like there was probably something deeper beyond that could be achieved. And I think as someone who like definitely moves a lot as a dancer, but also thinks a lot about music, it was one area that I really wanted to look into, especially after I learned the tools that I needed to be able to do this sort of research.
yeah, that's so cool. And
Me too.
I've talked a lot about like getting physical with your music and moving and how important it is. And I think it helps you get involved mentally in the performance, you know, through your body, through your movements, you get really absorbed in it. I would probably hate to hear what the sounds that would come out from my own personal movements be and how that would affect the sound of the music. But it's an interesting thing to see this. I also, I don't know if you caught the last performance at Loop, Caitlin Aurelia Smith.
Yes.
And
that was beautiful.
her dancers were incredible. And
They were
that,
amazing.
That was a really fun case for me of seeing like dancers that actually added a lot to the performance. Whereas, you know, not just kind of there to create excitement, but it was like part of the story of the music. And
Right, yeah. I definitely thought it was it was the perfect closer
yeah,
to
I
the
understood
entire
why.
conference. Yeah, it bridged like a lot of, and I was talking to a lot of people about this, even like my peers that had come with me on the trip, and they weren't necessarily dancers or fans of dance, but we were all talking about how just having that additional level of movement that was so closely related to whatever musical content was being created, that it just really took the live element of things to a whole different level. And for me, I feel as if like related to all of my work, whether it's like Claire Marie Lim or DollTr or related to the EDI educational stuff, I think that's a huge factor for me, being able to physically express what I'm also creating, and just make in the end just making a stronger connection and a better live, you know, experience for anyone who shares my music in the same space as me. So
Right. Yeah, it was very, very helpful in it. Because sometimes I guess electronic music performances can be a little static because you're sort of stuck behind your little machines and everything. And it was nice to see that extra energy brought up through the dancers. Whereas in a rock band, for instance, you know, the guitar player can start soloing on the knees or something and spinning around. But this was a nice way to bring that sort of energy to this kind of performance where you can't be running around the stage doing all kinds of, and her particular like gestures and the way she had something going on the floor. She kept tapping and the lights would change, and I'm not sure what was going on with that, but it was a nice part of it, and it just added to the whole world of the music, because that music is especially engulfing, I guess. And
Yeah, definitely. And I think that for Caitlin, especially because she's playing like a modular, you can't necessarily go wireless with that. Because
Yeah.
some people would try to go wireless, and I've been doing that to some extent as well. Like sometimes for my DollTr shows, I'll have my Q Neo with me by Keith Macmillan Instruments, but it has a wireless pack on the back that basically allows me to, if I want to, I can pick it up and I can walk around the stage
cool.
or even go into the audience and show people specifically what I'm doing with my stuff. So that's like an additional means of communicating, if you will. And it's funny that you mentioned the static stuff as well, like the idea of being electronic musicians being confined to a certain spot sometimes when they're performing. Basically, one thing that that was a huge thing for me as well at some point, because earlier in the year I participated in basically a music technology hackathon. And the idea was to create a new musical instrument. So they got 15 students from across the US, and they kind of dumped us into a place in Chicago. And this was a Red Bull hackathon. So they dumped us in the same spot, split us up into teams of 3, so 5 teams of 3. And each team had to come up with like a different new musical instrument that in a way should help to augment performance or improve musical expression. So my team actually came up with, it sounds really bizarre as well, but my team came up with what we call the beat mask. So it basically is a mask across, so you would wear it on your face, but it converts beatboxing into real drums in real time. So in that sense, it's like if you were a DJ who happened to be a really good beatboxer, or if you were a beatboxer who really wants to get into the more electronic side in live situations, you could wear that mask, you could beatbox into it, and it would essentially be able to trigger like MIDI notes that would then trigger drums. And it was cool because we also had, envelope followers. So basically every time a kick drum was detected or a snare drum was detected, you would get like LEDs on the mask that would light up correspondingly as a visual feedback kind of thing. But yeah, even that was just to address the whole issue of sometimes electronic music is performed in a very non-physical manner. As tiring as it can be, it's like it's not as physical, quote unquote, as if you took like a guitar and you walked up to the audience and you started shredding, so that even just having that weird new musical contraption that we came up with was also to address that issue. So
yeah, it's funny. I have like these funny, weird things, and these are probably just like stupid things I'll look back in 10 years, like because me being closed-minded or something. But so like guitar is a somewhat mobile instrument, but to me, this is just me. Sorry if this upsets anyone, but as soon as you put in the wireless guitar and there's no more restrictive chord and you start running around through the audience, there's something about me that just goes, ugh. Like it's like kind of cheesy or something. And it might be my first experience, because my first experience with this, we were playing with some band, these like kind of older washed up guys, and the guitar player ran out of the bar and into the parking lot. And I was outside in the parking lot at that time. And all of a sudden, the guitar player comes up to me, and we can't really hear the music. And he's kind of like rubbing up against us, like with his solo, and like getting in the middle of us. And it was like, what is this? What's going on?
Oh dear, I'm sorry.
So like, it was like, guitar is nice with the amount of freedom it gives you, but too much was like, it ruins it. But then on the other hand, when I play live electronic music with my little table of controls and contraptions, I made the decision not to use a microphone stand because I didn't like the way I felt. I had more freedom with my hands, but there was something about like having that mic, holding it, and like going out and going around with it that was so much just the energy felt so much better compared to like if I have my hands free and I can do a lot more and probably perform better. And the mic is in one spot, but having one hand with the mic, sometimes I'd find weird ways to like just put the mic on the table and put my head down by it and whatever. It just made for like a fun experience. There was just something about it that was the limitation of it, but also like the gripping, the physically like holding the music by grabbing the mic was kind of nice. But it's just funny to me how too much of that with like the guitar all of a sudden in my head is like kind of lame.
No, I actually agree though. Like right now at the moment for most of my shows when I perform my DollTr music, I actually use like a wireless mic, so like a Britney Spears kind of thing.
Yeah.
But if I had to choose between, if I had to use like a proper like a 58 or something, and I had to decide if I wanted it on a mic stand or just to hold it, I would probably choose just to hold it as well. I feel that you're right. There's something about that physicality of holding it and interacting with that in that certain sense. It's almost like it's a little bit like the relationship between a person and just their normal controller in some sense. It's like that physical element versus having something that's suspended in front of your face and you're just trying to meet it. And it's like what you said, you're instead of like being able to perform, you're actually kind of like at the mercy of the microphone because it's just in front of your face and you're just trying to reach for it. But in that sense, it reminds me of this. It's called the MC1, but it actually was created by multi-instrumentalist, and he uses it. He's like the godfather of controllerism, but he created this microphone that basically serves as, it's a physical thing that you have to hold. So when you grip around it, it has a series of buttons that kind of line up with your fingers, as well as I think a gyroscope or an accelerometer that kind of detects your position, and that gives him control of his vocal effects and processing when he performs live. And I think there's something super powerful in that when he performs, because I've seen him use it in a live setting, and it's just magical the way that he interacts with the mic that is also a controller. So
yeah, I've seen him use that. And I was thinking about him when we were talking about electric guitar, because he's got that Robocaster, right? Which is a real electric guitar with buttons and faders and all kinds of different MIDI elements. So which path does he go? And is he
that's interesting.
or is he the controller? Is he the EDI, electronic digital instrument? That's
yeah, I don't know.
That's funny. I thought about getting the headset, Britney Spears, Garth Brooks type of deal, right?
I would recommend it.
But I just didn't think it was going to work for what I do. But when again, just to go out to Caitlin and Riley Smith, her performance, I think it was much better that she had the headset, because her movements on the modular and with the buttons she's pressing with her feet, it was almost like a dance. And I think if she had to have, I mean, first of all, she's plugging wires in, turning knobs, and there's a lot of business going on there where I don't think she could spare one of her hands to hold a microphone. But it made her look more like she was almost just kind of dancing on the machines, with the machines, especially with the other dancers there.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was like we said before, that was like a clear instance of where everything just came together.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think about that performance and I still can't get over how well like the whole arc of the show was planned out. I mean, just thinking about the start of it to the finish and just the development of the movement and the music just came together completely. I won't stop like raving about it. So
yeah, I've thought a lot about it myself, and that was my first exposure to her too. And I've listened to the record since, and I see the dancers at certain parts. There's one part where they turn their heads left and right, and like when that song comes on, I was like, oh yeah. I remember just thinking about the dancers, like, how are they doing that for so long? I know my neck would be killing me, but it was like a good example, I guess, and maybe it's something that we're getting at in a way, is like ties back to the whole idea of this user customizable instrument, that there's really not a right answer. It really depends on what you're doing, what you're trying to go for with your performance. and sometimes it calls for the handheld mic, sometimes it calls for the mic stand. I imagine there are cases with the wireless guitar would be appropriate. Maybe someone can show
As long
me
as they
a video
don't like rub against you or something.
in the parking lot, right?
In the parking lot.
We're out here to be away from the music, man. You're coming to get us.
Yeah, I know. Oh my God.
But it's really dependent on what you're trying to do and what direction you're trying to go with the song, the music, the energy of the performance. It's all stuff that needs to be considered in your your gear. For me too, like one of the funny considerations I have that goes with my performance was the table I use I just got an email from someone yesterday that was asking me which table I recommend, because I talk about it every once in a while, that it's just a DJ table that has adjustable legs to like countertop height, and that helps me, being 6'3", not having to hunch over a smaller table and tire out my back, but also it limits the amount of gear I can fit on the table, so that determines a little bit about what I'm going to bring. But it also gives me an upright posture that I can have an energy, and I am holding the mic, and I'm like kind of like using it to like pull the crowd in. And whereas if I have to bend down a little bit, now my eyes, my face are down instead of forward, interacting and giving and receiving the energy.
It's so important that you mentioned that, because it's almost as if it's the opposite for me, but it's the same thing. Like I usually try to at least test out a table. I'm not at the stage yet where I can kind of request for a specific table, but I try to like test out and feel how it is, because I'm 5 feet. So it's like, for me, it's the opposite. If I have something that's a little bit too high, it just gets like it feels a little bit strange for me, almost like I'm swimming instead of playing actual controllers. And I even remember like when I was, because I used to even DJ on like turntables with vinyl and stuff. And when I was first starting out, my mentor used to get a little bit worried because I would basically almost look like a T-Rex, like on the decks. Like my arms would like be up and I would try to be scratched. And it was just a really weird position for my wrist and my elbow to be in. But then we came up with a solution that was actually proposed by another female DJ called DJ Shorty. She came to Berklee once to give a masterclass, and she was like, you should get some boxes. So we got some boxes, and from that day on, I was just practicing on the boxes, but immediately my body felt so much better. I was able to execute things better as like a technician. So it ended up working in my favor very, very well, just having that ideal physical component also be the best that it could be.
I could easily take that little compliment you gave me undeservedly. I do not get to request my own tables. I bring my table with me. No. So I'm not at that level either where I need the specific table with my red M&Ms and
I know, it's like it's so weird, because sometimes like I get very nice people who are willing to be a little bit more accommodating, or they're very thoughtful, and they're like, what would you like? And I'm like, I don't know, I'm not supposed to know these things yet, so please don't ask me.
I think, not to get too far off topic, but I think a fun story was like this whole idea of like bands telling they want a jar of M&Ms with the yellow ones taken out was not so much to be jerks, but to get some proof that they actually read the rider,
Right,
so it's like, okay, you read it if we have no so but this is a good point, because like your comfort with an instrument is really important. You're not going to sit at a drum set that you can't reach properly. You're not going to hold the guitar in a way that you can't play it well, and you're going to get tired. So just like you would with any traditional instrument, you need to have like the proper ergonomics, and you need that comfort where you can be in those positions for an hour or more. And more so even when you're practicing before the shows and you're rehearsing, like that's a lot of time to be in uncomfortable and potentially harmful positions.
Yeah, and we were actually, I mean, it's really less of a joke, but at some point me and my friends, we had a little joke about how the the introduction of EDI at Berklee is actually going to be a health benefit too, because people won't just be at their computers, hunched over, but
Yeah.
we'll actually see electronic musicians who don't look like they're looking at the floor all the time. Like you'll be sitting up and instead of looking at your computer and squinting and getting bad vision, you'll be like performing. So it was a joke at the time, but now it's really valid, I think. It's important to think about the ergonomics like you mentioned.
Yeah, technique, which is something like you don't always get when you're building your own stuff and you're kind of throwing together what you have, and I've got this old desk I can just use as my performance area, and it's way uncomfortable. Well, I think those are actually kind of maybe, I wouldn't even call them small, but those are results of putting this stuff in the proper light that it deserves. And I think it's important to remember that every instrument at some point was a new invention and a new idea, and probably frowned upon in some way. Obviously, like the electric guitar was. Bob Dylan was famously booed for using it, and the purists were angry that it didn't sound like a real guitar, but it became its own thing. And I think we will see, like by legitimizing it like this, I think we'll see some changes happen and some interesting growths, probably in a lot of unexpected ways.
Yeah, I think so too. And like even just going even further back, I can only imagine what happened when, say, the violin was introduced or something, and people were like, that's so different from what we're used to. And that's actually the analogy that was really given by one of my other professors, Erin Barra, also at Berklee, who, when she was talking about ADI, she was using that analogy. And I think you're right, it's really the same. It's about thinking about how we can go forward from here. Like now that we have this new idea or a new set of tools that we can use to make music, how do we go about, sharing it with the world in a way that makes sense for people?
Right. Well, now that it's got its proper arena, we might see that now that people are thinking about it and giving it actual consideration and not kind of frowning upon it because it's not a traditional thing, is important, because I mean that's where it's funny that like so much of the innovation in music lies in the areas that are not getting the attention from like traditional places. And
Absolutely.
I guess especially like popular music is, so many of the movements are born out of like people doing things the wrong way, incorrectly. And I really like this movement to embrace that and like recognize it.
Definitely.
So you're doing cool work with that, and
Thank you.
I think people should also check out a lot of the other stuff you're doing too, because it's very forward thinking and it's exciting.
Thank
to
you.
see.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's exciting to see people trying to challenge what it is to make music and see where we can take it. And I like that it comes from like a classically trained person too. That's just another nice thing about it, that it's because I think sometimes for myself as like a non-classically trained person, I kind of not self-taught necessarily. I did take my guitar lessons, but I didn't go through like the high school band and the proper, like I said, I don't read music. So I do once in a while get this kind of like, looking down the nose thing from people that are a little more traditional. And unfortunately, it's like a closed-mindedness where they're not realizing that there are these opportunities and room for expansion.
Right. And I think like a lot of it also comes from just the environment that you're in a way, because it's funny that you mentioned like the looking down upon, like, because it in some senses, because I was classically trained, but I went to Berklee, which is, historically a jazz school, sometimes I would get these looks from like jazz pianists who were like, oh, you play classical? And then it got even worse because it was like, oh, you play electronic, you play synths. So,
yeah, you play
but
the
hopefully
buttons.
things will
Cool.
change. Yeah, you just push buttons, and that's exactly what we're not looking for. So we're not looking for that in the program. So
Yeah. Well, I think as soon as you get in, like so many things too, as soon as you get into it a little bit below the surface, you realize it's a lot deeper than it might look firsthand. And I think giving like a little bit of credibility from an established institution like Berklee is important. So thank you for the work you're doing. It's very cool stuff.
No, thank you. You're doing such great work too. It's funny. I was just listening back to your podcast recording of the live performance that you did with at the game and stuff, which was really awesome. So I'm so glad to be able to see your work as well. I mean, you helped me. I've told you this already, but you helped me get started like with your packs unknowingly when I really started getting into production in the first place. So I remember downloading all the Afro DJ Max stuff that was available.
That's so cool. It makes me really happy to hear. And it's like just a great example of like the power of giving, you know, how like I think first putting out packs for free was like, you're giving away your work, like what are you doing? But it's not. It's like, as much as it is like a free thing, it's I get a lot out of it. I really do. Like and like to see people using it, and it's helping them make things. And I just love this idea. It's so common in the music, electronic music production world, the digital music, you know, especially the Ableton Live community has always been great like this, that this idea of just sharing your stuff, your ideas, and not keeping it secret and not protecting it, and no, you can't know how I got that vocal sound, but to share it, it does some cool things where it then puts it out into other people's hands who now take it to another level and take it further. And it also forces you to move on and try new things, because now your secret sauce is available to everybody. So you can't rely on it anymore. And it's not like it's not yours still either. You know, I think everyone does their own thing with it. So it's just really cool to see that, because I've talked to some people on the show where Jakob Hack, who does Hackathon, he does a lot of iPad music stuff, tutorials and stuff. He was talking about when he was trying to learn electronic music, how like no one would tell him anything. Like they were really like protective of it. And to me, like that, if it's not built on an insecurity that like if I give away like how to make a pattern on my 303, like I'm gonna lose all my, you know, credibility or something, or someone else to do it. But if it's not built there, it's going to create that, because then once that precious secret gets out, now what are you going to do? Like, oh no, now you're ruined kind of thing, where I think so many people are realizing now that that's just not the way it is. It actually is in your own benefit, because it just comes back around.
Right. And like you mentioned, I think that's one of the reasons why I love like the Ableton community so much, because I mean, we were both at Loop, and for me, one of the best parts about Loop, even beyond just seeing the wonderful talks and performances, was really getting to meet other people and share things with them. Like, I can't even remember how many people I talked to and like how many people whose contact info I got that I actually ended up connecting with afterwards, even after the whole conference. And it was just amazing to see the idea of mutual support. And I think that's what one of my favorite parts about being in the Ableton world is, just that idea of helping each other. And even the Max world, because now that Cycling 74 is with Ableton as well, the idea of building things off other people's patches and creating new technology. Like, I wouldn't have been able to do any of my own devices work if the Max community online hadn't existed, because I was just asking questions on the forum, looking through previous forum posts, and the idea of, you know, just working together to build something instead of trying to work at tearing other people down, like you mentioned. I think that's definitely an approach that needs to be remembered.
Sure. I don't know, without the internet, without this like community of people,
definitely,
I really don't know if I would have gotten anywhere with music production. I mean, because I did not go to school for it, and I do remember having that feeling. Like a couple of my friends did go to music school, like to learn, and they were in the studios, and I remember being like, oh man, like I want to do that. And like I felt like I wasn't in the club, you know. And now just a few years later, when things like YouTube really started taking off in tutorials and people sharing stuff, it was like, well, I can catch up, I can be a part of this too. And you know, there's no reason to feel like you can't be in there. So it's really nice. It's got to be in the long run contributing to like just better music and more artists and accessibility to the arts and expression, and new ideas will come out of that, I'm sure.
I'm sure too.
Cool. Listen, it was a lot of fun talking to you.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun talking to you too.
Good to get to meet you, and I'm really happy about your work. I think it's great, and the stuff
Thank
you're
you.
involved in is important work, and it's going to do good for the future. So thanks for that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I mean, you as well. Like it's really just so inspirational to be able to even talk to you. I hope you weren't too surprised when I came up to you at Loop and I was like, "You're Afro DJ Mac."
I was totally
like having
surprised.
a weird a weird moment. I was like, "Whoa, it's Brian Funk." So
Well, I'm always surprised, So in a good way though, not like the weird way. So where can people go to find you? Where do you like to direct people? Because you're around in a
Right,
couple
so-
places.
yeah, I am. And usually I direct most people to my two websites. So I have one that's www.clairemarilim.com. That's mainly for my more professional work, if you will. And then I have my other website, which is www.DollTrick.com. And that's where you can find my DollTrick work that's more performer, producer, live show, giggy type stuff.
Is that more like the artist kind of persona?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, more of like the artist side of stuff that I hide behind, but no, but I like kind of like splitting my work up a little bit, but at the same time, I can't deny that it's related in a lot of
Yeah.
ways to each other. But yeah, it's those two websites are mainly my two platforms for reaching
Are
out.
you spelling DollTrick with an exclamation point as the I?
Right, so I usually stylize it with a lowercase d and with an exclamation point, but my website itself doesn't have the exclamation point.
Okay.
So it's TRICK. But otherwise, sometimes, yeah, my work is listed with DOLLTR exclamation mark CK.
Okay,
which is
but when we go into
stylized.
Google, we'll write an I.
Yes, please.
Okay, excellent. Very cool. Well, thanks so much for taking the time, and thank you to everyone listening. I highly recommend that you check out Claire's work. Lots of cool stuff, and like I said, very kind of on the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of new technologies, and incorporating that into actual like legitimate academia, and it's really cool. So check it out, and thanks a lot, Claire.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, take care, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye.